Hello, my name is Caleb Dresser. I'm an emergency physician, and I also serve as co-chair of Wadham's Climate Change Special Interest Group. We're going to spend a couple of minutes today talking about how climate change affects the disaster risk equation and the disaster cycle, and how we can think about both of these in the context of climate change. Let's start with the risk equation. This is something many of you are likely familiar with, this idea that the overall risk associated with a disaster is a function of hazard, i.e. the physical impacts of that disaster, the exposure, where those occur, whether you're exposed to them, vulnerability, how much those are able to impact you given the characteristics of where you live or your institution, and then the capacity of an individual, a social group, a society, or an institution to deal with those impacts when they occur. Where does climate change fit into this? Well, really, this is a big issue for hazard and exposure. If we think about hazard, for example, thinking about the amount of rainfall occurring during a severe storm, climate change is leading to warmer temperatures that can increase evaporation from bodies of water, including lakes and oceans. And in warmer air, there is a greater moisture carrying capacity. All of that means that a storm can hold more water and dump more water when it rains. That is an increased hazard for flooding. And that is climate responsive in many settings. There are a wide variety of examples of this. Higher summertime temperatures during heat waves is another example. Exposure is also being affected by climate change. An example of this is whether or not a dwelling or an institution is potentially exposed to coastal storm surge during a tropical cyclone. Sea level is rising as a result of climate change. Tropical cyclones are experiencing intensification in some basins. And so together, this means that storm surge risk in coastal areas is going up in large part because the number of buildings, the number of locations on coastlines that can experience storm surge flooding has increased. The exposure to this hazard has increased. On the other end of this equation, we have vulnerability and capacity. Now, there are some second and third order effects where these are also being impacted by climate change. For example, if high summertime temperatures are affecting ability to work, that could have economic impacts, and that could then affect things like vulnerability and capacity within a community. If communities have been repeatedly displaced by climate-related disasters, that may interfere with social connections, that may also affect capacity. But these two areas are also spaces in which there's a lot of opportunity for institutions, for communities to take action to deal with the increasing hazard and exposure that they are experiencing through reductions in vulnerability and increases in capacity. So let's map this onto the disaster cycle. And credit to this image to Doctors Byram and Patwari. There's really a lot out there already on this disaster cycle, but suffice to say that the idea here is that dealing with disaster risk requires this constant iterative process where when a disaster occurs, yes, you respond to that and there's a recovery period, but you don't stop there. You also make sure that long term, you are trying to mitigate or prevent disasters from occurring, and that you are preparing for these events before they occur. So what does climate change mean for this cycle? Well, it raises a lot of questions at every stage. So in the response section, we are seeing a lot of disasters lately that are connected with climate change. This raises questions about how sustainable a response-based approach really is. What is the capacity to execute effective disaster response if you're seeing more disasters, larger disasters, more people affected in more settings? There are limits to operational capabilities, and this needs to be thought about carefully. In the recovery phase of a disaster, it's important to think about what we are recovering to. Is the goal to return to how things were before the disaster? Is the goal to build back better? Is the goal to build back better in a way that acknowledges the escalating disaster risk we just talked about on the previous slide, and perhaps integrates data and computer projections of future flood probability or heat probability or storm surge exposure. This is an important conversation that has to be happening even in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. From a mitigation and prevention standpoint, when we add climate change to this cycle, it gets very complicated because we have always had tropical cyclones, we have always had floods, we have always had fires. But climate change is now contributing to the intensity, in some cases, the frequency, and the exposure to these events. And so there are large-scale policy questions here around what we can do to reduce the intensity of climate change, for example, transforming energy systems away from fossil fuels, what we can do to position communities so that they are safe. And this is where conversations around managed retreat or building back in more elevated locations after a flood can happen. And those are ethically and practically very complicated conversations. And this is also where bigger picture strategy around built environment and green infrastructure really comes into play. And then finally, from a preparation standpoint, what do you prepare for? In a given location around the planet, you might be dealing with exposure to intermittent tropical cyclones every few years, annual summertime heat, and occasional severe cloudburst events. How do you prioritize which hazards you work on in your location? How do you allocate resources, which are finite, to this preparedness activity? And this is a really important opportunity for disaster and emergency professionals to work with climate scientists and others in policymaking roles to understand these risks and prioritize resources effectively. Finally, let's look at the timeline of a disaster. A lot of people tend to focus on the immediate impact phase, the visible hazards, the storm surge, and these are where really arresting pictures happen, and these are very dramatic events. But we are increasingly seeing in the literature that there are a lot of impacts that happen long after the hazard has ended. These are people who experience health problems because their cancer care was disrupted, or they can't get their blood pressure medicine refilled. These are people who have lost their jobs and are now dealing with being unhoused and dealing with new financial constraints that they did not have before the disaster. So thinking about this societal disruption phase is also really important, as is thinking about the long-term implications, the changed lives after major disasters. Climate change is adding to the level of attention we need to pay, particularly to the very long-term consequences. Because if you're in a location that has been experiencing increasingly frequent flooding effects, this is both about the immediate flooding effect, right? Are there sandbags around your house? Did your house flood? But it's also about long-term mold exposure. It's about whether you can even afford to build back in that location and whether that's a good idea. Are you better off building or moving to a setting where you're not going to flood again? And this is where that last section, the changed lives, becomes a really complicated but important conversation, so that we are thinking about long-term risk reduction whenever possible, and also are setting up systems to deal with the situations many people will find themselves in as increasingly frequent and intense climate responsive disasters affect their livelihoods, their homes, and their ability to return to what was for them a normal life. Lots to explore in this area. Interested in hearing about examples from your practice or areas where further education on this topic would be helpful. I will close there for today.